This is a so-called Renaissance lute. It has 10 double strings. The basses are tuned in octaves. And these strings, for example, are tuned unison. And the first string is a single string. And the name lute goes back to the Arabic name for this kind of instrument, al-oud, which means something like the wood instrument. And that came into Spain in probably between the 10th and the 12th century, when the Arabs were living in Spain at that time. And then, of course, the instruments became popular also for the European musicians. But it retained, first of all, the Arabic decoration here in the middle. And then the names are all derived from alud, also Spanish laúd, Italian liuto, German laute, English lute. So they all go back to the Arabic origins of this instrument. Romansch is lute. Probably taken from the French version of the name, and it takes the masculines il lutte. But a lot of Romansh-speaking people say la lutte because they think of it as die Laute, but it's il lutte. Even very prestigious, educated Romanchuns will still say la lutte, and I have to correct them every time, with pleasure. My name is Robert Grossman, and I grew up in California, and I live now in the Grisons. I've been here since 1984, because part of my family comes from Switzerland, and I lived in Lausanne for a while with my uncle, and then I went back to the States. Actually, in 1971, I met a Romansh girl and fell in love with her. And then it was a very short and intense relationship. But when I went back to California, each one went their own way. So I was acquainted with the language, but I was a shortwave radio person, and I listened to all the, at that time it was like internet, and I listened to the broadcasts of the different countries, and the broadcast of Swiss Radio International had, I think almost every week, had a lesson in Romansh, and I would follow that very closely. And then I was invited as a guest to study at the Music Academy in Basel, and met my wife, now my ex-wife, there. I was in love with Engadine anyway, and then I saw there was a position for a guitar teacher in Ober-Engadine, and so I applied and I got the job. One of my first experiences as a music teacher or a guitar teacher in Ober-Engadine, and that's that the language and culture and the just the attitude, the viewpoint of the people here is so intensively influenced by the mountains and the valleys. And so when I would talk to my kids and we would talk about melodies going up and down, then they would say that when I would say the melody would go up, they would say it back to me like la mélodie va amunt ou aval, and that means like the melody going up means it's going up the mountain, and then the melody going down, it's going down to the valley. So that was just, I was astonished to hear that, and it stayed with me many, many years. This is one of my favorite things about my experiences with the Romanish language. When I moved there in the 80s to be a music teacher in the Upper Engadine, I had studied musicology, and I found out there was a library that had some music manuscripts in Cezaplanta. So I went there, not expecting anything dramatic, and I had the surprise of my life when the librarian brought out a manuscript for the lute. I was astounded, and was very interested to learn what the history of this manuscript and what kind of music is in it, because the music is written in a very special notation, this kind of what's called tablature, which no modern musician can read. It takes a specialist to learn that. Then I decided to put that into modern musical notation so that this wonderful music would be available to all musicians. That's very unusual to find in manuscript in Switzerland, especially in this part of Switzerland. And it proves that the young people who learned instruments from the von Salis and von Planta families were playing at home, and that was part of their development, the same as being well-read in literature and to know something about art. In the years since I published these books, it's been played on many, many CDs and in concerts, and people really enjoy the music. And that's made me very happy that I took the energy and initiative back in the late 1980s. So I play something out of this manuscript from Sameden. When I visit my family, when my parents were still living, they had a house they're near San Diego, north of San Diego, where I grew up. I would go with my kids when they were, not real little, but maybe 9, 10 years old. We would walk to the shopping center, which was, with the car, it was like 5 minutes, and walking it maybe was 15, 20 minutes. So we would walk, and we would be the only people on the sidewalk, on the streets. There would be nobody else. And then to cross the streets are like a river, these huge streets. And when we were walking, I would walk with my kids, and the people would look at the cars like we were crazy. Like, they're walking? That's, nobody does that. So that's one thing. They don't walk anywhere. They go everywhere in the car because everything is also further away from each other. There's no center village. I grew up in a place that was always warm or hot, and the Engadine was always cold. And when people say, how can you come from Southern California to Engadine, almost 1,800 meters? And then I say, because they're both extreme climates. One is just always hot, and the other one is always cold. One is always summer with 2 or 3 weeks of fall, and Engadine is always winter with 2 or 3 weeks of summer. So they're very similar in that sense. Actually, I found myself feeling at home. I've spoke so many languages in my life that sometimes I get confused. And then I'll start talking a language to somebody and just be talking for a few minutes, and then they say, I didn't understand the word you said. And then I realized I was speaking with them the wrong language. This book, Surfing in San Diego, that was when I was young. I lived for surfing and going to the beach. And I came out of a family of surfers, and my older brother was quite famous. And this is the definitive history of surfing in San Diego, and my brother's in here. So he was also a lifeguard in San Diego. This is my older brother here. And we would go at 6 in the morning to go surfing and stay the whole day. We enjoyed that life very much. I grew up 15 minutes from Mexico, So I was well acquainted with Romance languages. Well, it's funny because Spanish, when I came to Basel, I was speaking Spanish to the students from Spain and from Catalonia. And then when I started learning and speaking Romanish, Spanish went away. I understand it, but I can't speak it anymore. It's like my storage room in my computer head was full. So when Romance came in, the computer decided Spanish goes out, you know. And so when I came here, it was logical that Romanish would be part of that group of languages. And I did not speak German at that point. So there was a wonderful teacher in La Punt Jamuești, and she wanted to learn guitar as quickly as possible and very intensively. And I wanted to learn Romanish as quickly as possible and intensively. So we had a guitar lesson and then a language lesson, and sometimes a few times a week. And I just made it a goal of mine, and it was necessary to survive. I had to teach in a language, and I couldn't speak German. And so I just gave all my energy and discipline to learn this language as quickly as possible. So I learned Romanish, and in Engadine for a couple of years at least, I only spoke English and Romanish. And when I tried to speak German, everyone thought, well, he comes from some sort of small village at the end of a valley and only went to the 6th grade and didn't learn German properly. The best tip I can give is that don't learn German. Because if you can't speak German, the Romanish people have to speak Romanish with you or English. But if you speak German, and there's the first difficulty to understand a Romanish person, most of the Romanish people will switch to German and stay in German. The moment you show that you're not very sure in the language, they'll switch to German. And if you can't speak German, they're forced to stay in Romanish, and that's a very great advantage. Well, of course, the Romanish does not have the extensive vocabulary, technical areas, and also there's very few people, I have to say, who are capable of having a very complicated philosophical discussion about history, metaphysics, and civilization in Romanish. There are some, and they're brilliant people, but the normal Romanish person would speak much more competently about a complicated technical or philosophical subject or political subject in German. If you hear a technical or philosophical or political discussion in Romanish, then there will be much more German words in that discussion than if you just talk about everyday things in Romanish. Il Presidente Valdei, my Romanish chamber opera from 1988, was in Romansh Grijun. When I came to Engadine, it's just like many people come to Engadine and they're inspired by the region, by the nature, by the light, and by the isolation. And then I started composing again there. And the story of John Fontana also is fabulous. It's still very, very relevant today, the relationship with the people who live here and the people who come here. And the relationship between Romanish and German-speaking people, and the relationship between the general population and then the travelers, and how that relationship has developed since after the war. So it was very relevant and moved me very much, and so I was inspired to do this opera. And that was translated into Romansh Grijun from Benny Vigne, who was also a very early and intensive supporter of Romansh Grijun. And I don't really have an emotional reaction to it, but after a while, I think as a written language, there was not really a problem, but when they tried to expand it into using as a spoken language, in the radio or television or in theater pieces or books, I witnessed many very intensive reactions almost to the point that they were fighting each other, hitting each other and shouting and in families not talking to one another, and it was very, very intense for a while. I've hardly ever had an experience where I didn't understand an English speaking person. Maybe 5 times in my life where somebody came from the Scottish Highlands and had a very, very, very heavy Scottish accent, or somebody from Australia who from the outback, but it's very, very rare. I've done a lot of projects with Romanish-speaking people of other idioms, but when I first started in 1984 to speak the language, I, like many Engadiner, had to speak German with the people from the Surselva. I remember I had difficulties even with the numbers and months, like Fanadur, Teklador. I still, after 30 years, I still can't get it right. And then sometimes I'll say a time or a date in German to make sure that I don't come a month earlier than I should to an appointment. And then I think after the efforts of the Romanish radio and television to include the idioms in their broadcasts, I think over 20, 30 years, it's improved the situation quite radically. For me, the puter of the Upper Engadine is a wonderful idiom, and I think it's the most beautiful of the Romanish idioms. It has the A, the predominance of the A vowel, and I just love the way an N becomes an M at the end of words, and it's just the rhythm of the language.